Matt is an experienced content strategist at K15T with a history of working in the computer software industry. Throughout his time as a technical communicator, Matt has branched out to marketing and UX writing projects with multiple teams. Let me just see it a little bit better. He believes that the best experience when information presented by sales, marketing, the product and the team is when it uses a unified voice. His webinar will explore how Agile teams can rapidly develop and deliver documentation alongside their product. And with that, I will, if I can find the button, stop sharing and hand over to Matt.
All right, thanks, Ellis. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen all right. Let's go ahead and get started. So,
yeah, we can see your screen now. That's great.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So today I wanted to talk a little bit, as Ellis mentioned, about how to create documentation within an Agile process. Maybe I'm the only one, but when I was first asked to do technical writing within an Agile process, it didn't seem to make sense. It didn't really fit with what Agile seems to be about. And I'm not here to give you all the answers because if there's one thing I know about Agile, it's about embracing change. And so I don't have all the right answers, but I think we can all learn from each other here today. So just a little bit about me. I am Matt Reiner, and I work for a company called K15T. I do tech writing with them, among other things. I guess technically I'm a customer advocate. So that means I meet with our customers or potential customers and see how they're using our apps, how we can make them better. And I really enjoy this because I used to be a user of our apps. So as a tech writer, I used our apps. They're for doing tech writing in Confluence. So now I get to talk with people just like myself, which I enjoy a lot. But that background is pretty helpful for this talk because I, at one point, have been a project manager. I've acted as a Scrum Master for several teams. I've been a systems administrator for several different systems, including Jira, which is a really handy Agile tool. I've even been a network planner in a past life. So I've worked with a lot of different teams, including marketing teams, and I've worn a lot of hats. And one thing I have experienced many times is people really hyping Agile, like as this is going to be the solution for everything. Agile is going to make our teams, you know, they're going to be more efficient. They're going to be faster. They're going to be stronger. Whatever the case may be, whether it's a leader who went to a conference and they, heard that it's so amazing, or if it's somebody on the team, I've heard that Agile is the solution for everything, right? And you may have heard that as well. But the challenge that I've seen is I feel like Agile works really well for software development, but then I really struggled with figuring out where does documentation fit into that. And that's often because the process, the Agile process, depending on the framework you're using, it seems kind of like it's a mess. Like as technical writers, we're here to nail down what's the absolute truth, and that's what we're describing. And then we go to a stand-up meeting the next day after writing that, and something has changed. In fact, that's sort of the whole process, is everything keeps changing. And so sure, we're supposed to embrace change, but how do we write the truth then? How do we document things if things keep changing? So for a little while, I struggled with doubts of like, maybe this just doesn't work. Maybe y'all need to do some Agile development over here and then hand it to me at the end, and I'll just document what it is you create, very much like waterfall style. And maybe you're feeling the same way. So I just want to share what I've learned, what we at K15T have learned, and hopefully there's some things to help you there. And then also if you have thoughts or ideas, please feel free to share those at the end when we look at questions. So just sort of briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Agile, very shortly, and how documentation fits in. And then we're going to walk through the different phases. So first we'll talk about how you document what it is users want and how the team plans to deliver it. Then we'll talk a bit about working with your Agile team to write full set of documentation. Then we'll talk a bit about how we do documentation testing right alongside Agile testing, and then how we deliver our documentation right alongside the product, and then how we continue to review and iterate that content to make sure that it's constantly being improved, just like everything else in the Agile process. So first up, let's talk a little bit about the roots of Agile and where it came from, and honestly how we can fit Agile into it. So I've heard a lot of people say that, well, it doesn't fit into Agile. In fact, it isn't even needed. There have been some teams that are like, we're just going to create this iteratively and it's going to be so good we don't even need documentation. Well, that's a talk for another time, but that's not true. And documentation is really, really important in Agile. And in fact, it's one of the major outputs of the Agile process. It's just not, it doesn't play the role in product development that it used to. And to see kind of how that's changed, we can look at the history of Agile. So Agile came about in 2001, sort of officially, when a group of individuals coming out of software engineering, but at that time, software was, nobody knew how to build it as a team. How do you have a software development project? And though software was really becoming really essential to most businesses, the assumption was made, oh, well, we just engineer software the same way we engineer hardware. So that means major amounts of documentation. You build tons of documentation at the very beginning of the process as you're doing discovery, and then you create plans and project plans and all sorts of things, and then you document your entire software development and the entire QA process, and then you write user documentation. So it was a very document-heavy process. And it involved very strict plans. So once you've laid out a plan, you shouldn't change from it, which is true in hardware, right? You really want to make sure that you build what you set out to build. But that lack of ability to change or vary almost always led to failures. Excuse me. And it also led to projects going way too long, because they would plan out a 2-year project to deliver some software at the end of it, and by the time they were 6 months in, requirements had changed, or a new development occurred, and so it was invalid. And so this group in 2001 got so frustrated with that they wrote what's known as the Agile Manifesto, which I think the group said they're anarchists, which I think is funny, but it's not. I love some of the statements on this document. So one of the things they said, that it's an alternative to the document-driven heavyweight software development process that they were all used to. And so from this, many different Agile frameworks have arisen, things like Scrum and Kanban and the Spotify approach. There's many frameworks out there, but all of them include these values from the manifesto. So an Agile process values individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It values working software over comprehensive documentation. It values customer collaboration over contract negotiation. I really like that one. And then it values responding to change over following a plan. So, okay, this sounds great for software developers. I can't imagine any engineer enjoying contract negotiations. So sure, they have these statements, but how does documentation fit into this? In fact, it seems like they've made some pretty strong claims about documentation not working. Well, let's look at sort of what documentation has become. So with the manifesto, there's a few statements like extensive documentation is not preferred. It's not highly valued. They also say, we embrace documentation, but not hundreds of pages of never maintained and rarely used tomes, which I think that really sums it up very well. So some of the keys to understanding what documentation looks like in an Agile process is, rather than creating massive collections of content throughout, we're actually trying to minimize as much content that is created as possible, and instead start with a very small nutshell of content and slowly build from there. So at the end, you have one timeline of content that has been grown and improved, rather than massive clumps of content that are thrown away and never used, because the investment there is so much more significant. So we really want to end up with that one set of up-to-date user documentation at the end, rather than the huge paper trail that we used to create. So let's walk through the different phases of the Agile process and look at, just some tips for how we can incorporate documentation into each. And as I mentioned, there are lots of different frameworks for doing Agile. This talk, the aim is to keep out of the framework land. So I'm just going to talk about the phases that are included in all frameworks, Agile frameworks, pretty much. You'll have to, consider how you would implement this within your team. The good news is your team is already doing all of these things if you're working in an Agile framework. So just be creative in how you can fit this in. So the first phase in an Agile process is the requirements phase. And this is the place where the team works together to figure out, what is it that we're going to give to users? What are they looking for? Is this a new feature? Is it maybe an improvement on an existing feature? What's our goal here? And the team documents, kind of roughly what it is that we're going to give. And what is written in this phase can actually be used as the first step toward proper documentation. So this far back in the process, we're already creating documentation, and it's pretty cool. But it doesn't look exactly the way you would expect. Instead, when a new feature is developed, the team creates 3 different pieces of content that are really, really useful to us. It's just sort of foreign to the way that I had done writing in the past. So, and also, just like great documentation, these are written by the entire team. So your product manager, your software developers, you as a technical writer, your QA people, maybe everyone on the team is involved in creating this content, which means maybe it's not written beautifully, but it's very, very accurate, has a lot of thoughts incorporated. And in fact, when these pieces of information are created, this is a really good time for you, especially, to document questions that the team has, questions that you have an answer to, but those might be really valuable in the future, along with assumptions that the team makes. And these are really handy when you get to the very end and you're proofing your documentation, and you can say, oh, yeah, did we think about this? Oh, yes, we did. Here's the question. Here's the answer. This is a really good time to capture that. And most of that is captured right within an Agile process. So let's look at these 3 pieces of information that are created and what we can do with them as tech writers. So the first thing that's created is an epic. And an epic is an overall description of what are we setting out to do as a team. It's also a collection of a narrative of what it is the user wants to do, sort of overall, almost like just a story. This is the thing that is important to users. So for example, our users want to be able to have an equipment inventory for our app that lets them organize the whole process of loading and refueling their rockets to blast into space, right? So they want this new feature so they can maintain, figure out how to plan the inventory on their rockets so they can, get off the planet without too much weight. So epics include a really, really good description that all the team works together to write. They help with product development because you can begin to figure out what features we need to code. It helps with testing, and of course, it helps with documentation. In fact, right away, it tells us, okay, do we need to create a whole new section in our documentation for a brand new feature, which is the case here, or are we revising an existing feature? And in that case, we can very clearly see which section in our documentation we need to revise. So right away, it's already cluing us into where do we need to start creating this new content in our existing documentation. And I really like this because we can essentially, we no longer have to begin from a blank page. We already have here a description of what is the feature that we're building for users, which when you sit down to start writing documentation, that's really the first thing that you write. And now we have this one that's very insightful. We've gotten information from all across the team. So the next piece of information that we get is user stories. So user stories are a very short narrative of what it is our users are looking to do, who our users are, and why they're looking to do that thing. User stories are really important to help all team members, no matter what role they play, to understand and quickly relate to our users. And it helps us understand the tasks that users need to be able to complete. You as a technical writer can map these out directly as capabilities within your documentation. So often that epic that we talked about, that tends to be a concept topic, right? It's a description. It becomes an overview of what is the new feature. You could think of these as most often the headings within that concept topic. So as an example, in our rocket scenario, the two user stories might be load balancing. So as a mission planner, I need the equipment, I need to be able to balance the equipment so the rocket will fly correctly. And also as a mission planner, I may need to be able to get shareable lists of all of the equipment in the inventory to pass on to mission control. So there's two really good user stories. It explains who the user is, what they need to do, why they need to do it. And these really help us understand what to document. This is essentially telling us what are the things that our users care about that this feature can do. So as I mentioned, maybe these are headings or subheadings within that introductory concept page, or if these are very large capabilities that users need, it may become sub-concept topics beneath your main concept topic for the feature. But you can see how we can already start to build a content map based on these elements that the team has created. And we even have, even some user research behind these. We know what it is that motivates users, which is great because we don't have to try to derive that from thin air as writers. So the next thing that we will create are acceptance criteria. So these are the conditions that our product must satisfy in order for the feature to be accepted by users. So these are perfectly mapped to task topics that you would create or that you would document. So in this example, for the load balancing feature, users need to be able to add an item to the inventory. They need to add custom equipment subtypes in case the ones that we ship with the product aren't enough. And maybe they need to modify the items on the list. Pretty standard thing. So it's sort of essentially a checklist. I need to do this. I need to do this. I need to do this. And as tech writers, we can clearly see, oh, these are jobs that our users need to do. These are tasks that matter to them. So we can essentially either right away create task topics for each of these, or we can, if we have a page that includes all the tasks for this particular feature, we can add each of those as headings right on that page. Here's how you add an item to the inventory. Here's how you do this. Here's how you do that, etc. So we have essentially created a full map of the content we need to create from the pieces of content that are created in in a standard Agile process, which I think is really huge, that we don't have to just start creating something from nothing. So the next phase in the process is the development phase, which if we were software engineers, this would mean we were going to start writing code and start building the features that meet the needs of our users. But for us as technical writers, this is the part of the process where we work with the team to start writing the documentation. And when I say that, we've already written quite a bit of it, right? We can already take from the epic and user stories and acceptance criteria. So we already have quite a bit of content that exists. Is it perfect? No, but none of the Agile process is. In fact, the team is, everybody's sort of going off those assumptions that we made. Like, this is what we think we're building. This is what we're planning on building. But if you've worked with software long enough, you know things always change. Something doesn't work the way you expected. So don't get frustrated, or I would encourage you to try not to get frustrated if you write something down and then, you know, the next day someone comes and says, oh, well, something changed. In fact, I like to suggest that everybody is sort of guessing their way through. We're relatively certain that we know how things are going to turn out, but we're not completely sure. It's really, the Agile process is about being honest with the fact that none of us know completely what it is we're building. We're just, you know, figuring it out together. So there's a few techniques that I found are really helpful when doing this. So the first is writing fiction. And this is one of my favorite documentation techniques because it helps me stay sane when things change. So as your team starts to begin developing, like from day one, you can start writing fiction, which is essentially based on what we planned on doing. This is what I imagine our app is going to do. And yes, it's completely fictional. You're going out on a limb and sort of presuming a lot of things, but you have epics in user stories and acceptance criteria. So you can write a very informed piece of fiction. All the task topics, all of the concept topics and so on, you have enough to go off to really imagine what should this thing do. And remember, that's exactly what the engineers are doing as well. They're building features, assuming that what the outcome will be. So be ready to revise that fiction, obviously. Just like with any piece of writing, you know, it's not complete after the first draft. That's especially important to remember here. We should expect to go to stand up and hear something and have to go and revise that. But the goal here is we're not writing in stone. We're just tracing in the sand, sort of getting our thoughts started. Because we're 80% sure we know what the outcome is going to be already. And that means we can start writing way ahead of time. We don't have to wait for things to be done. One thing I would caution is don't write down things, or don't add things like screenshots or diagrams, things that take a lot of time to change, because you might be seeing like mock-ups of the UI at this point in the process. Just put in placeholders for those and say, I will add a screenshot, it will be a picture of this. So add details there, but don't add the actual thing that will waste time. So then once we've written the fiction, we wait until the work is actually done. You know, the development work is done, UIs have been nailed down. Then you can go through and read through the documentation and verify it. You're going from fiction to nonfiction. Politicians are really good at this in both directions. We're trying to think of ourselves as the users, and then actually, you know, walk through the app, see, is this accurate? Did I tell the truth here? What do I need to change? And this is also the time to replace those placeholders you added. So go in, add your screenshots because you have good UI now. Make sure your diagrams are all set. And just like that, you have created a final draft of your documentation, mostly from guesswork, which is, you know, kind of fun. And then you validated your guesswork, and now it's ready to go. So now it's time for a team review. And this is a hard part because you have to convince your team to review content, but also there's lots of arguments to be made for the value of this. The best content is written as a team. I absolutely believe that. And so I found best success I've had is having two different teammates do a grammar and style review and a technical accuracy review. So the grammar and style review, you know, that's the kind of thing where you review, are we using a consistent voice, an empathetic tone, proper grammar? And this is often best done by a person who's comfortable with the language you're writing in. They don't need to be English majors though, or majors in whatever language you're writing in. I try to enable my colleagues by creating a really simple style guide, something where they can see quick examples of what to look for and go with that. You'll be surprised at the people who will be comfortable reviewing writing if you show them that writing isn't that difficult. So yeah, definitely get that grammar and style review. I know people have caught so many dumb typos from me. I really appreciate that. And then the second one is a technical accuracy review. So this is often best done by the person who wrote the code because they have access to the notes in the code. I really hope they put notes in the code, and also they know what they did. So we want to make sure the content is true to life. Did we capture all of the, the edge cases? Are we describing it right? Those sorts of things. And we really want to do this as quickly as possible after the work is done. That's one of the benefits of Agile, is working quickly. We don't want to document things 2 weeks after they're complete. Because if you ask an engineer to review documentation on a thing they did 2 weeks ago, they don't remember what they did 2 weeks ago. I don't remember what I did 2 hours ago, especially when we're in these careers where we're generating a lot of new creative things. We forget very quickly what we've done. So we will be most successful if we review things almost immediately after they are completed. And that's why that documentation fiction approach is really, really valuable to the team. And then we can quickly move to the next thing, which Agile is all about. So now we're going to move to the testing phase. So this, on the product development side, the code has been written, we sort of have this complete, and now we pass this to the QA testing team, or maybe the same team does a QA testing phase, but essentially they're trying to poke holes in the product to see if they can break it, the way a user might actually use it. For us writing documentation, this is where we test the quality of the documentation, and we get really, really important feedback. This is not a time where you're going to be revising major pieces of your documentation. Instead, this is where you're going to get really tiny bits of feedback that will add up to maybe changes in sentences or information boxes that will become really, really valuable in the future, because you'll have that extra little bit of information that only users would have asked, well, what about this? So I find this really important, but often ignored, because you might be thinking, well, who's going to do this? I don't have any resources to do this. I don't have time to QA my stuff. I'm biased anyway because I wrote it. So I have a few thoughts on who can help with that. And there's really sort of two ideal ways to do it. The first is to get your documentation as part of the quality assurance testing that your team does, whether your team is doing it or an outside team. QA testers and QA testing are ideal for finding issues with documentation. That's literally what QA is all about. And it's a really good time to have people looking at your documentation, because you're trying to look at things from a user's perspective as much as absolutely possible. So as your testers are setting up, using, and modifying the product, have them read the accompanying documentation. And you can do this because you have it ready. If this were a waterfall approach, it wouldn't even be done yet. You would probably write the documentation after QA, which is too late. So instead, you can pass it to them as they're getting the code, which is really great for the team, because not only can they learn about the product as if they were users learning about it for the first time, but also it can help and aid in the creation of test plans, because Agile test plans are most likely derived from those same epics, user stories, and acceptance criteria. And so now you have documentation with perhaps even more information that will help the team test the product in really robust ways and make sure it does what it is the documentation says it should do. So I found that to be really effective, as long as you have that documentation ready and can pass it to QA with the rest of the app. The other thing is early user testing. So this is a really important part of the Agile process, and it's the idea that the customer or the user of the product should be involved in the process. Practically, that ends up looking something like the product manager knows a few users who are, really close. They're very interested in new features, and so they're willing to try out new things before they're officially released. So you really want to align with the product manager and get those users documentation along with the product they're testing. Because normally when a product manager passes those kinds of things over, they write a super long email describing to them, okay, here's the features, here's how you use them. Why not just send them a PDF of the documentation, right? You do a PDF for something that is secure so that only they are seeing that up and coming documentation. But don't have the product manager explain it to them, just pass them the documentation, have them read it through. That is the most unbiased way to get feedback. And it's a prime way to understand the direct needs of users. So now we move to the delivery phase of the Agile process. And this is a really important phase for on the software side, because you really need to be at a point where, okay, QA is done, we can release immediately. Continuous delivery is a really important topic in the Agile community, and it's really, really hard to do, especially with software. But it's additionally difficult with technical writing. This is where we essentially have our documentation ready to go when the app is ready to go. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I've been in many situations back in my waterfall days where I was the one holding up product releases because the documentation wasn't written, or we just release it without documentation and then support bears the brunt of that. So we're here to make sure that by this point in the process, documentation is ready to go. We can publish in many different ways, right? You might distribute PDFs, you might have an online help center, maybe both, depending on your type of product, right? But there are a few things to consider in this phase, no matter how you deliver. So the first thing is timing. Documentation needs to be in your users' hands as soon as they get the product, or maybe slightly beforehand, right? Maybe a day before or an hour before, but you do not want to deliver your documentation late. This whole Agile process depends on on-time delivery of documentation. So that means you need to be in step and involved in the same processes that your team is using to deliver the rest of your documentation. And I don't mean maybe, it doesn't have to be technically connected, but you or whoever publishes the documentation needs to be signaled, okay, we're releasing the bits of the application, we're releasing the documentation, however that works. Your publishing option should be simple enough for anyone on the team to do it. That's a core concept of most Agile frameworks, is anyone in the team should be able to step in and help. If someone is out sick or someone's on vacation, somebody else should be able to push the button. So not just an engineer and not just a tech writer. Anyone on the team should be able to trigger that publishing. And it has to be reliable and reproducible, the process of releasing documentation. That's another core part of Agile and continuous delivery. So it needs to be a dependable part of the release, especially if you're going to convince more technical people that documentation is essential for our product. Every part of the process of creating it has to be as dependable as the processes for creating code. So sometimes documentation needs to be updated after we initially publish it, right? We find typos, we find additional clarifications that need to be made. We get feedback from whomever. So be sure your publishing method allows for really rapid iteration so that you can make quick changes and publish them very, very quickly and get them in the hands of users, which is why I generally avoid PDFs as much as possible. That I think help centers are better, some kind of online approach for delivering content just for that reason alone. Publishing needs to be a painless process because you may need to do it many, many times very quickly, right in that first week after you release, for example. For example, my team uses our app Scroll Versions, which is just like once we've written the content in Confluence or updated it, it's just a button click to republish those changes. And so that that's great for us because I don't even need to be the one to do it. It might be somebody who's doing our support. They click the button and the content is out there ready to go. Anybody on my team has access to it. The next thing is, it's really important that your documentation looks as good as the product, if not more so. If we want to build trust with users, it's got to fit, right? We cannot provide content that is inaccessible, that looks bad, that doesn't fit on their device screen. At this point, it's 2020. We need our content to be available in all those ways. Consider the cost of like hiring somebody to like implement that all custom, and also supporting that in the future. That can be fairly costly. I found, at least for myself, I need something that is very consistently working all the time, that looks great, it's really simple to implement, and perhaps it's even continuously updated so that I don't need to keep hiring a web developer to match new web standards and those kinds of things. My team uses our app Scroll Viewport. It has a theme built into it. We set it up once. I've never touched it after that, which I love because I like to write. I don't like to do design. Another really important thing for some teams is archival. So how are you planning to get your content to users who maybe are using an older version? For those types of things, maybe you give them access to old content on PDFs. Maybe it's on other websites, but have some sort of plan there as part of your release process. Okay, we're pushing the new content. What happens to the old stuff? That needs to be part of the process, part of your consideration, because otherwise it'll just be swept away. For example, with us, we have just a version selector, so you can look at old versions on our help site, even though most users update immediately to the latest. But then also we will provide one-off PDFs for people who ask, although I don't remember the last time somebody asked for one of those. Okay, so moving to the last phase of the Agile development process, and that is the feedback phase. So this is the part for the software side where we get early feedback from users or from our support team, and we are making changes, fixing bugs, those sorts of things. Often there's like 1 or 2 weeks after a release where you're straightening everything out or improving features, that kind of thing. For the documentation side of things, this is the part where we continue to improve our documentation now that it's in the hands of our customers and people are really asking the difficult questions, and we are also clarifying things. So excuse me. One of the things that I think is really important here is to give users a really easy way to give you feedback. Most of the time, users will go to the product support team to comment on functionality of the app, but it's harder to get comments and feedback on your documentation because generally users are potentially already frustrated a little bit when they're reading documentation. So the idea of taking time to write you a note to say what needs to change, that's even more a harder ask. So make it as simple as possible. Add one of those "was this helpful" kind of prompts somewhere in your help center that is hopefully generated automatically. Or even if you are distributing PDFs, a really good way to get that feedback loop from PDFs is add a link in the footer or the header of your documents, or even a QR code that will take users to a simple web form where they can give you feedback. That way, maybe they've printed the documentation, it's in their hand, but they can scan it really quickly with their camera on their phone and give you feedback. It's really essential for the Agile process to be able to iterate with that kind of user feedback. If possible, also signal to users when their feedback is incorporated. Certainly an email back is really handy if you can do that. Or if it's anonymized and you don't get to know who submitted things, note it in your product's change log and say, here's all the documentation changes we made because users requested that. Give users feedback, feedback on their feedback, letting them know, yes, we care, we've incorporated this, thank you for your thoughts and ideas. Another really useful place to get feedback is from our support team. They are talking with their customers all the time. Now, certainly some of the feedback we get is fairly nuanced because it has very customer specific edge cases and things. So that doesn't always signal that we need to update documentation. But very often a tight relationship here is really important if we're practicing Agile. So what I found to be successful is help the support team, give them, help them with a good solution for creating knowledge-based articles, a good tool there or whatever, a good process. And then also give them a really easy way to give you feedback on documentation is if there is something that needs to be improved, because they just don't have much time in their day, right? So they have SLAs they're working against. And I found this relationship, it's not just a you giving them, it's very symbiotic. So good documentation, it reduces support burden. We know that, the more we can help users, the more we deflect them from having to talk to support reps. So that's how we very much help the team. But also a knowledge base, a good knowledge base from a support team can help signal to us as tech writers where we need to write new documentation, where we need to beef up our content, that sort of thing. So that's a really good place for feedback. This last suggestion always makes me uncomfortable because when I start to think about time tracking, I start to think about the micromanagers that I have worked for in the past. And I think about like having to do time logging just so they can see what I've been doing every minute. And I don't know about you, but I hate that so much. Luckily, I've worked for good managers, so I know what that's like too. But that's not really what I'm talking about. As part of Agile, it's ideal to log the time that you spend on different activities. And this is really important, not for management, but for your team as a whole, because you really need to see how much time did we spend on things. And if you think about documentation, this is a place where we often lose track of that. We think about how much time we as tech writers spent on something, but we forget there was time spent by all of our subject matter experts who reviewed the content. How much time did they spend? And then I made more revisions and sent it back to them. How much time was that? So essentially, we should use a tool like, I don't know, Trello or Jira or something where the team is tracking how much work did we, or how much time did we spend on each of these items? And then we can go back and look at those after the fact. And this is great for drawing out two things. One is, okay, we spent too much time working on a piece of content, right? Maybe we produced a ton of content, but it turns out it's not been really valuable to users. They're still asking questions. So we probably should have spent less time. Or maybe we spent too little time on something. Maybe we wrote it, but people are still very unsure what it is the thing is doing. Maybe we needed to write more, or maybe we needed to write better. So those are two really key indicators that we can pull out of time logs is, did we spend too much time? Did we not spend enough time? Or what is a thing that we need to do in the future that we're not doing now? And often the most valuable things will be outliers. So things where we spent way more time on than other tasks, or ones where we spent way less time than other documentation tasks. It's a very academic experience, but again, it's not about micromanagement. It's about helping the team get better at estimating how long things will take and planning what it is you really need to do to give great documentation to your users. So that's it. We've run through all the phases. And I would encourage you, no matter the framework your team uses, or even what phase you're in right now, documentation can be assembled really rapidly within that Agile process. You just have to be creative with how you think about how it's created and what that final deliverable, is going to be. So, remember that end goal is when you get ready to release, your documentation is also ready to release. So I think now it's time for questions. So you're welcome to ask them in the chat. Let's see. Speaker view is always hard. Where is the chat? There it is. Or I think you can also unmute yourself and ask. Let's see.
I think if people put their questions in the chat, that might be the best way of doing things. Thank you for that, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if anyone has got any questions for Matt, feel free to use the chat and ask them. It was a very comprehensive presentation, so you may have had all your questions answered anyway. From Alison, there's one from Alison. Can you see that, Matt?
Yeah. Questions about Scrum meetings. All right, I'm excited about this. Do I feel like I need to attend them all? Okay. That's a good question. And I'm probably not the only tech writer who's living the life where I'm actually like working with multiple teams. So they're all having daily stand-ups. I'm very honest with the teams that I work with. I tried to be upfront with the fact that sometimes my work with them is not the primary thing I need to work on. And so we've actually sort of established a pretty good culture among all of my teams where if we shouldn't be in a meeting anymore, if it's a waste of our time, we just leave. And the team understands that's not a, you know, I'm not setting out to offend them. I'm just being honest. Hey, I'm no longer valuable here. So what I try to do is communicate with teams based on what I know. So like right now I'm working with the Scroll Documents team very heavily. So I'm in that Slack channel talking with them. I attend a lot of their meetings. But then the Scroll Viewport team, I'm doing very little with them. So I don't go to any of their meetings. But it's mostly, I found, just about talking to the team and letting them know I'm not going to be there because I don't think it's important. And then also asking them, if something comes up that I need to know, please tell me. That doesn't mean that's perfect, because even today, I realized something from the Scroll Viewport team that I wish I knew, because I should be documenting that stuff. So that's not a perfect solution, but having allies within each team who will help catch things and get them back to you somehow, that's really helpful. I've had luck with that. Let's see. How do you cope with development teams that resist the idea of needing documentation? Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the things I like to do is I like to sit down with the team and ask them questions about the app that, the app they're building, and try to get as technical as I can. That often helps expose what is that, the curse of knowledge, right? Where you know so much about the thing that you don't know that you know so much about it. Sometimes asking the stupid questions helps people see how little all the rest of us know about the thing. So that's one area. Another area I found is working with the support team, drawing out user support cases where users were successful because of documentation and sharing those with the team. And then finally, try to bring your teammates in as subject matter experts. I know a lot of people feel uncomfortable writing, including myself some days. Maybe that's just me. But bringing them in and saying, hey, I just wrote this and you know so much more than I do, or you've really been in it. Would you mind reviewing this and see if I'm explaining this well? That can give them a much more, more thoughtful time to look at what is this documentation about? Why is it valuable to users? I think that can be great. Also, if you do have like Google Analytics going, you can show them some, I don't know, deflection rates as far as like keeping people out of support, if your system gives you those kind of metrics, or just how many readers are reading, how many minutes they're spending. Those types of things can be valuable for the analytics oriented folks.
I think we're 5 minutes over time, so I think that's probably all we can, which is my fault because I stole some of your time in doing the introductions. If people want to follow up and ask the questions, you're on Twitter. Is that the best way of contacting you? How would be if people did have the questions and wanted to follow up? What's the best way?
Yeah, that would work. I'm on Twitter. I'm also, there's my email as well. And Ellis, maybe, I think you can send along all the questions after the Zoom is done. I would be happy to, if I can email people directly, I will do that. But yeah, find me on Twitter. Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Matt.